The handshake felt like a performance. Every Sunday dinner for 8 years, Donald Harmon would grip my hand with that same practiced pressure, his smile radiating manufactured warmth, while his eyes calculated something I couldn't quite grasp. "Lawrence, good to see you again," he'd say, pumping my hand twice before releasing it. "How's business at Parish Electric?" I'd respond with the usual pleasantries about contracts and city projects, watching him nod with apparent interest. Meanwhile, Vivian would busy herself in our kitchen, her auburn hair catching the overhead light as she moved between counters with increasing restlessness. Those dinners had become rituals of polite conversation and growing silences. Donald would praise the roast, compliment our house, ask about the girls' college plans. Standard father-in-law material, except for the way his gaze would drift to his phone every few minutes, checking messages with the urgency of someone expecting important news. "Dad's been stressed about his consulting work," Vivian would explain whenever I mentioned his distracted behavior. "You know how demanding those corporate clients can be." I knew about demanding clients. Running an electrical contracting business meant dealing with architects who changed specifications weekly, city inspectors who found problems where none existed, and property developers who expected miracles on impossible timelines. But Donald's stress felt different. It carried the weight of secrets rather than deadlines. The first real crack in the facade appeared 3 months ago. Vivian had started taking evening walks, claiming she needed exercise and fresh air. Noble goals, except her walks always coincided with phone calls that sent her hurrying toward the door with barely coherent explanations. "Emergency at Dad's place," she'd say, grabbing keys and purse. "Plumbing issue. You know how helpless he gets with maintenance problems." Strange how a retired corporate consultant who'd managed million-dollar projects suddenly couldn't handle a leaky faucet. Stranger still how these emergencies always seemed to occur during prime-time television hours, lasting well past midnight. My suspicions crystallized during a particularly transparent performance. Vivian's phone buzzed during dinner, displaying a text preview that made her face flush. She glanced at the message, then at me, her expression cycling through surprise, guilt, and poorly constructed innocence. "Dad again?" I asked, noting how quickly she'd flipped the phone face down. "Actually, it's Lisa. Girl troubles. You know how dramatic she gets about relationships." Lisa Martinez had been Vivian's college roommate and remained her closest confidant. I'd met her dozens of times over the years, and she struck me as many things: ambitious, opinionated, occasionally self-centered, but never dramatic about relationships. If anything, Lisa approached dating with the emotional detachment of a business transaction. "Must be serious if she needs immediate consultation," I said, watching Vivian's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "Some things can't wait, Lawrence. Female friendships require maintenance." She left 20 minutes later, wearing a dress I'd never seen before and perfume that seemed too elaborate for consoling a heartbroken friend. The scent lingered in our hallway long after her car disappeared down the street. That night marked the beginning of my education in surveillance. Not the high-tech, movie-style variety involving hidden cameras and professional equipment, but the mundane reality of tracking patterns, noting inconsistencies, and documenting the small lies that accumulate into larger truths. I started with simple observations. Vivian's evening emergencies followed a rough schedule: Tuesday and Thursday nights, occasional weekends when I worked late or traveled for business. Her explanations varied: Lisa's relationship drama, her father's household crises, book club meetings that ran overtime, yoga classes that apparently occurred at irregular intervals. The yoga excuse particularly amused me. Vivian had shown zero interest in physical fitness during our entire marriage. She avoided gyms, skipped neighborhood walks, and considered gardening sufficient exercise. Yet suddenly, she'd discovered an urgent need for spiritual and physical alignment that required evening sessions at a studio she couldn't quite name. "It's new," she'd explain when I asked about location or scheduling. "Very informal. We just meet when everyone's available." Modern yoga studios operated like businesses, with fixed schedules, membership fees, and online booking systems. The informal approach seemed unlikely, but I let the explanation slide while making mental notes about timing and frequency. My breakthrough came through technology rather than detective work. Vivian had always been careless with her devices, leaving phones unlocked and laptops open. Privacy had never been an issue between us because we'd never had secrets worth protecting. That trust became my advantage when suspicion finally overcame respect for her personal space. The opportunity presented itself on a Saturday morning while she showered. Her phone sat on the nightstand, buzzing with incoming messages. The preview screen showed a conversation thread with someone listed simply as C in her contacts. "Tonight works better. He's traveling until Sunday." "Same place as usual?" "Yes. Looking forward to it." The messages carried an intimacy that transcended friendship or family obligation. These weren't communications about plumbing emergencies or relationship counseling. They suggested coordination, anticipation, and careful timing around my schedule. I memorized the phone number associated with C and spent the following week researching its origin. Reverse lookup services provided an address in the upscale Riverside district, registered to Craig Ellison. The name triggered immediate recognition: Vivian's college boyfriend, the relationship that had supposedly ended amicably years before we met. According to Vivian's version of history, she and Craig had dated seriously during their senior year, but realized they wanted different futures. He'd planned to pursue graduate school on the East Coast, while she preferred staying local. They'd parted as friends, maintaining occasional contact through social media, but nothing more significant. That narrative suddenly required revision. Craig Ellison lived 15 minutes from our house, worked as a marketing director for a regional healthcare company, and apparently maintained regular evening appointments with my wife. The revelation demanded action, but I forced myself to proceed methodically. Accusations based on suspicious text messages might prompt explanations, denials, or more careful concealment. I needed comprehensive evidence before confronting anyone about anything. My solution came from the same technology that had exposed the problem. Vivian's phone included location services that could be monitored through our shared family account. With a few adjustments to privacy settings that she'd never bothered to review, I gained access to her real-time location data. The tracking began immediately. Tuesday evening brought the familiar routine: dinner, casual conversation, then a phone call that sent Vivian rushing toward the door with apologetic explanations about her father's latest domestic crisis. "Garbage disposal this time," she said, grabbing her purse and keys. "You know how he panics about anything involving electricity or plumbing." I waited 30 minutes before checking her location. The GPS coordinates placed her phone at Craig Ellison's address in Riverside, approximately 8 miles from her father's actual residence in the opposite direction. Thursday's emergency involved Lisa's relationship drama, but location services again contradicted the explanation. Vivian's phone remained stationary at Craig's address from 8:30 until nearly midnight, while Lisa Martinez posted Instagram updates from a downtown restaurant with colleagues from her law firm. The pattern continued for 3 weeks. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Vivian would manufacture urgent situations requiring her immediate attention, then spend hours at Craig Ellison's apartment while providing false information about her actual whereabouts. But the most disturbing discovery involved her father's role in the deception. Donald Harmon's phone location data, accessible through family plan sharing he'd requested for emergency purposes, revealed troubling coordination with Vivian's movements. On multiple occasions, Donald's vehicle appeared at our house shortly before Vivian's departures. He would arrive, wait 15 to 20 minutes, then drive directly to Craig's neighborhood. The timing suggested he was providing transportation, ensuring Vivian could maintain her evening appointments without leaving her own car in compromising locations. The man who shook my hand every Sunday dinner, who praised my business success and asked about my family's future, was actively facilitating his daughter's infidelity. His warm greetings and friendly concern masked a calculated betrayal that extended beyond simple adultery into deliberate conspiracy. This revelation transformed my approach from suspicious observation to systematic documentation. If Vivian and her father were coordinating deception, I needed evidence comprehensive enough to expose both their roles and protect my interests in any resulting legal proceedings. The next phase required patience and precision. I established a routine of careful documentation, treating the investigation like a complex electrical project where every connection had to be verified and every component tested before energizing the system. My home office became mission control. I created encrypted files on my personal laptop, separate from any devices or accounts Vivian might access. Each evening's surveillance produced data points, departure times, arrival coordinates, duration of visits, and return schedules. The information painted a detailed picture of routine deception. But I needed more than location data. Digital evidence could be questioned, dismissed as technical errors or misunderstandings. I required multiple sources of verification, including visual confirmation and witness testimony. The Riverside District offered excellent surveillance opportunities. Craig's apartment complex featured open parking areas visible from adjacent streets, with clear sight lines to building entrances. I could position myself in nearby locations and document arrivals and departures without trespassing or violating privacy laws. Tuesday evening surveillance confirmed what GPS data had suggested. Donald's silver sedan arrived at the complex at 7:45, parking near the main entrance. Vivian emerged from the passenger seat wearing an outfit I'd never seen, a black dress that seemed too formal for emergency plumbing assistance. She walked directly to Building C, Unit 247, using a key to enter without knocking or waiting for Craig to answer the door. The casual access suggested this wasn't a recent development. She'd been visiting frequently enough to warrant her own key. Donald remained in his car for approximately 10 minutes, apparently ensuring Vivian's safe arrival before departing. His phone location data showed he returned home, maintaining the fiction that his daughter was visiting him for household emergencies. I photographed the entire sequence from a coffee shop parking lot across the street, using a telephoto lens that provided clear images without requiring proximity to the subjects. The photos captured license plates, building numbers, timestamps, and faces, irrefutable documentation of deception. Thursday's surveillance yielded similar results, with one significant addition. Craig Ellison appeared on his balcony during Vivian's visit, visible through sliding glass doors that opened onto the unit's outdoor space. He was clearly comfortable, wearing casual clothes and holding what appeared to be a glass of wine. This wasn't emergency assistance or friendly counseling. It was a romantic evening between two people who'd established comfortable routines in private space. But I still needed to understand the full scope of coordination between Vivian and her father. Donald's involvement suggested planning beyond simple transportation. He was actively enabling the deception, providing alibis and logistical support that made the affair possible. My opportunity for deeper investigation came during Vivian's next girls' weekend trip. She'd announced plans to visit college friends in Chicago, a monthly tradition that had started 6 months earlier. The timing coincided with my increased suspicions, making the trip worth scrutinizing. "Lisa's organizing something special," Vivian explained, while packing clothes that seemed more suitable for romantic getaways than casual friend gatherings. Spa treatments, nice dinners, that sort of thing. I waited until her departure before calling Lisa Martinez directly. We'd exchanged phone numbers years earlier for emergency contact purposes, and I'd maintained cordial relationships with most of Vivian's close friends. "Lawrence, hi," Lisa said, answering on the second ring. "What's going on?" "Just checking on Vivian's Chicago plans. She mentioned you were organizing activities, and I wanted to make sure she had everything she needed." Silence stretched across the connection before Lisa responded with obvious confusion. Chicago plans? Lawrence, I'm not sure what you mean. I haven't organized anything in Chicago. The girls' weekend. Vivian said you were coordinating spa treatments and dinners. I think there might be some miscommunication. I'm actually in Denver this weekend for a work conference. Have been planning this trip for months. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Lisa expressing genuine concern about Vivian's whereabouts, and my growing realization that the Chicago story was completely fabricated. Location services provided the truth. Vivian's phone showed coordinates for a resort in the Pocono Mountains, approximately 6 hours from our home. Cross-referencing with Craig Ellison's social media accounts revealed recent posts from the same general area, including photos of mountain views and resort amenities. They were spending romantic weekends together, while I believed my wife was maintaining friendships in Chicago. The deception had evolved from evening visits to elaborate getaways requiring extensive coordination and planning. But the most damaging discovery involved Donald's financial participation in the affair. Bank records, accessible through our joint accounts, showed regular transfers to Vivian's personal checking account that coincided with her Chicago trips. The amounts ranged from $300 to $800, sufficient to cover resort expenses, dining, and travel costs. Her father wasn't just providing transportation and alibis, he was financially subsidizing her infidelity, ensuring she could maintain the affair without raising questions about unexplained expenses on our shared credit cards. This revelation elevated the situation beyond personal betrayal into potential legal complications. If divorce proceedings became necessary, Donald's financial support for Vivian's adultery could impact settlement negotiations, custody arrangements, and asset distribution. I needed comprehensive documentation before confronting anyone about anything. The evidence had to be bulletproof, covering every aspect of the deception and leaving no room for alternative explanations or denials. My research expanded to include Craig Ellison's background, employment history, and current circumstances. Public records revealed he'd been divorced 18 months earlier, with proceedings that involved allegations of infidelity and financial misconduct. His ex-wife had received substantial alimony payments and primary custody of their 2 children. The pattern suggested Craig had experience with extramarital relationships and their consequences. He wasn't an innocent party swept up in unexpected romance. He was someone who'd previously destroyed a marriage through similar behavior and was now targeting mine. This information provided crucial context for understanding the affair's progression and potential outcomes. Craig wasn't likely to leave his current situation for a permanent relationship with Vivian. He was enjoying the benefits of companionship without commitment, while she risked everything for someone who'd already demonstrated his unreliability. But I still needed to understand the full timeline of deception. When had the affair started? How long had Donald been involved? Were there other participants or enablers I hadn't identified? The answers came through systematic analysis of phone records, bank statements, and location data spanning the previous year. Patterns emerged that revealed the affair's evolution from occasional contact to regular meetings to elaborate weekend getaways. Initial communications between Vivian and Craig had begun 14 months earlier, shortly after his divorce proceedings concluded. Phone records showed brief, infrequent calls that gradually increased in duration and frequency. Donald's involvement started 8 months ago, coinciding with the first suspicious evening emergencies and his requests for family plan access to location services. His participation had enabled the affair's expansion from occasional meetings to regular appointments. The Chicago weekend trips had started 6 months earlier, supported by Donald's financial contributions and requiring elaborate coordination between all 3 participants. I was documenting a conspiracy that had been developing for over a year, involving systematic deception, financial fraud, and careful planning to conceal adultery. The evidence was comprehensive, detailed, and legally significant. But before proceeding with confrontation or legal action, I needed one final piece of verification. I had to confirm that my interpretation of events was accurate and that alternative explanations weren't possible. Constance Whitmore's law office occupied the top floor of a renovated downtown building that had once housed the city's largest department store. The space retained elements of its commercial past: exposed brick walls, hardwood floors, and large windows that provided expansive views of the business district. I'd selected Constance after researching family law practitioners with reputations for thorough preparation and aggressive advocacy. Her credentials included 15 years of divorce litigation, board certification in family law, and client testimonials that emphasized her attention to detail and strategic thinking. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, greeting me in the reception area with a firm handshake and direct eye contact. "Please come in." Her private office reflected professional competence without ostentation. Law books lined built-in shelves, diplomas and certifications covered one wall, and a large desk dominated the center of the room. Everything suggested serious work rather than impressive display. "I appreciate you meeting on short notice," I said, settling into a leather chair across from her desk. "Your message indicated urgency regarding potential divorce proceedings. I always prioritize consultations involving time-sensitive situations." I'd brought 2 briefcases containing printed documentation, location data, photographs, phone records, bank statements, and timeline analyses. The evidence filled multiple folders organized by category and chronological sequence. "Before we discuss specifics," Constance said, "I need to understand your objectives. Are you seeking information about divorce procedures, or have you decided to proceed with filing?" "Information first. I want to understand my options before making irreversible decisions." She nodded approvingly. "Wise approach. Many people file impulsively and regret not exploring alternatives or preparing more thoroughly." I began with basic facts: 8-year marriage, no children, joint ownership of home and business assets, and recent discovery of my wife's infidelity. Constance listened without interruption, taking notes on a legal pad. "You mentioned evidence," she said when I finished the overview. "What type of documentation do you have?" I opened the first briefcase and began presenting materials in organized sequence. Location data showing Vivian's regular visits to Craig Ellison's apartment, photographs documenting her arrivals and departures, phone records revealing communication patterns, bank statements showing unexplained transfers from her father. Constance examined each item carefully, asking questions about methodology, legal acquisition, and chain of custody. Her focus was professional rather than judgmental. She was evaluating evidence quality rather than moral implications. "This is remarkably thorough," she said, after reviewing the complete presentation. "You've documented systematic deception over an extended period. The location data is particularly compelling because it's objective and verifiable." "What about her father's involvement? Does that create additional legal complications?" "Potentially. If he's been financially supporting the adultery, that could impact property settlement negotiations. Courts consider marital misconduct when dividing assets, especially if one spouse has dissipated marital resources to support extramarital relationships." She explained the legal framework surrounding adultery, property division, and third-party involvement in marital dissolution. Tennessee law allowed courts to consider adultery when determining alimony obligations and asset distribution, particularly if the unfaithful spouse had used marital funds to support the affair. "Donald Harmon's financial contributions to your wife's infidelity could be recoverable," Constance continued, "if you can prove he knowingly subsidized adultery using funds that should have supported the marital estate. You might have claims against both him and your wife." The conversation continued for 90 minutes, covering procedural requirements, timeline expectations, and strategic considerations. Constance outlined various approaches ranging from immediate filing to negotiated settlements to collaborative divorce processes. "My recommendation is to gather additional evidence before proceeding," she said. You have strong documentation, but I'd like to see more direct proof of the affair's physical nature and your father-in-law's knowing participation. What type of additional evidence? Witness testimony would be valuable. Hotel records, if they're traveling together. Credit card statements showing joint purchases. Communications that explicitly reference the affair rather than just coordinating meetings. She suggested hiring a private investigator to supplement my amateur surveillance efforts. Professional investigators had access to resources and techniques that could provide more comprehensive documentation while ensuring legal admissibility. However, she added, your existing evidence is already sufficient to establish adultery and financial misconduct. The additional documentation would strengthen our position but isn't strictly necessary for successful proceedings. I left the consultation with clear understanding of my legal options and strategic alternatives. The evidence supported strong claims for divorce based on adultery, with potential recovery of funds Donald had used to subsidize the affair. But I also realized that legal proceedings would only address financial and procedural aspects of the betrayal. The emotional damage and personal violations required different types of resolution. That evening, I reviewed my documentation with new perspective gained from Constance's analysis. The evidence was comprehensive and legally significant, but it also represented something more personal. Proof that two people I'd trusted completely had conspired to deceive me for over a year. Donald Harmon's handshakes and friendly conversations had masked calculated betrayal. His questions about my business and travel schedule had been intelligence gathering to facilitate his daughter's infidelity. His requests for family plan access had been reconnaissance rather than emergency preparation. Vivian's evening emergencies and weekend trips had been elaborate performances designed to maintain the affair while preserving the appearance of marital commitment. Her concerns about my work stress and travel demands had been manipulation rather than genuine care. The conspiracy had required extensive coordination, careful timing, and systematic deception. Both participants had invested significant effort in maintaining the fraud while appearing to support our marriage. This realization transformed my approach from legal preparation to personal reckoning. I had comprehensive evidence of systematic betrayal, but I also had opportunity for strategic response that went beyond divorce proceedings. The next phase would involve confrontation, but on my terms and timing, rather than reactive discovery. I would control the revelation process, ensuring maximum impact and minimum opportunity for damage control or alternative explanations. But first, I needed one final piece of verification. I had to confirm that my evidence was accurate and that confrontation was warranted rather than premature. Thursday evening arrived with familiar routine. Vivian received her usual phone call during dinner, followed by the predictable performance of concern and urgency that had become her signature deception. Dad's having issues with his electrical panel, she announced, already reaching for her purse and keys. You know how dangerous those old systems can be. The irony wasn't lost on me. After 8 years of marriage to an electrical contractor, she was claiming her father needed emergency assistance with power distribution problems. If the situation were genuine, I would be the logical person to provide professional help. Want me to come along? I offered, knowing she'd decline but curious about her excuse. No need. He just wants someone there while the repair service works. You know how nervous he gets about strangers in his house. Another fabrication. Donald Harmon had spent 30 years managing corporate facilities and dealing with maintenance contractors. He wasn't nervous about repair services or strangers in his house. I'll probably be late, Vivian continued, moving toward the door with practiced efficiency. These electrical problems can take hours to resolve properly. She left at 7:30, wearing a burgundy dress I'd never seen and carrying an overnight bag that seemed excessive for electrical panel emergencies. The performance had become so routine that she'd stopped bothering with convincing details. I waited 15 minutes before beginning my final surveillance mission. This time, I wouldn't be documenting routine deception. I would be gathering evidence for immediate confrontation and legal action. My position in the coffee shop parking lot provided clear views of Craig's apartment complex while maintaining sufficient distance to avoid detection. The telephoto lens allowed detailed photography without requiring proximity to the subjects. Donald's silver sedan arrived at 7:52, parking in the same location he'd used for previous drop-offs. Vivian emerged from the passenger seat, kissed her father's cheek through the driver's window, and walked directly to Building C with confident familiarity. But tonight's surveillance would extend beyond documentation of arrival. I planned to remain in position long enough to photograph their departure and confirm the duration of the visit. Complete documentation would eliminate any possibility of alternative explanations. The wait provided time for reflection on the year-long deception and its systematic nature. This wasn't impulsive adultery or emotional mistake. It was calculated betrayal involving extensive planning, financial support, and careful coordination between multiple participants. Vivian and Craig appeared on his balcony at 8:30, visible through sliding glass doors that opened onto the unit's outdoor space. They were clearly comfortable together, sharing wine and conversation with the intimacy of established routine. I photographed their interaction through the telephoto lens, capturing images that showed obvious romantic involvement rather than emergency assistance or friendly counseling. The pictures would eliminate any possibility of innocent explanations. At 9:15, my phone buzzed with an incoming text message from Vivian. "Dad's electrical problems more complicated than expected. Might be very late tonight, don't wait up." The message arrived while I could see her on Craig's balcony, wine glass in hand, clearly engaged in romantic conversation rather than electrical emergencies. The real-time contradiction between her communication and actual behavior provided perfect documentation of systematic deception. I photographed the text message timestamp alongside images of Vivian on the balcony, creating irrefutable evidence that she was lying about her location and activities while actively deceiving me through false communications. But the evening's most significant discovery occurred at 10:45, when Donald returned to the apartment complex. His sedan appeared in the parking area, and he walked directly to Building C, using his own key to enter Craig's apartment. This wasn't simple transportation support. Donald had independent access to the location where his daughter was conducting her affair. He was a full participant in the deception rather than merely an enabler. I photographed his arrival, key usage, and entry into the building. The images documented his active involvement in facilitating and participating in the conspiracy against me. The three of them remained in Craig's apartment until nearly midnight, when Donald and Vivian emerged together. She appeared relaxed and satisfied, showing no signs of stress that would accompany genuine emergency assistance. They drove directly to Donald's house, where Vivian retrieved her own car before returning home. The coordination allowed her to maintain the fiction that she'd been at her father's residence all evening while actually spending hours at her lover's apartment. I arrived home 10 minutes before Vivian, ensuring I appeared to have been there all evening. When she entered the house at 12:30, I was reading in the living room with the television playing background noise. "How did the electrical work go?" I asked, noting her slightly disheveled appearance and the lingering scent of unfamiliar cologne. "Finally got it resolved. Dad was really stressed about the whole situation, but the repair service knew what they were doing." She delivered the lie with practiced ease, maintaining eye contact and showing no signs of guilt or discomfort. The deception had become so routine that she could fabricate detailed explanations without apparent effort. "Good thing he had you there for moral support," I replied, watching her nod agreement while knowing she'd spent the evening in another man's bed. That night, I finalized my documentation and prepared for confrontation. The evidence was comprehensive, legally admissible, and personally devastating. I had proof of systematic adultery, financial conspiracy, and coordinated deception spanning over a year. But I also had something more valuable: complete understanding of their methods, timing, and coordination. I knew exactly how they operated, which gave me strategic advantages for controlling the confrontation process. The next phase would involve direct action, but on my terms and according to my timeline. I would expose their conspiracy when and how I chose, ensuring maximum impact and minimum opportunity for damage control. Friday morning brought the beginning of the end. I called Constance Whitmore's office and scheduled an emergency meeting to finalize divorce proceedings. Then I contacted a process server to arrange immediate delivery of legal documents. The confrontation would occur within 48 hours, supported by irrefutable evidence and strategic planning. Donald Harmon's handshakes and Vivian's performances were about to encounter reality. Saturday morning arrived with deceptive normalcy. Vivian prepared coffee and discussed weekend plans while I reviewed final preparations for the confrontation that would reshape our lives permanently. "I'm thinking about visiting Dad this afternoon," she said, buttering toast with casual efficiency. "He mentioned wanting help organizing some old files." Another fabrication, delivered with the same practiced ease that had characterized a year of systematic deception. But this time, I was prepared to respond with comprehensive evidence rather than polite acceptance. "Actually, I need to discuss something important with you first," I said, setting down my coffee cup and maintaining direct eye contact. "We need to talk about Craig Ellison." The change in her expression was immediate and unmistakable. Color drained from her face, her hand froze mid-motion with the butter knife, and her eyes widened with the recognition that her carefully constructed deception was collapsing. "I don't know what you mean," she said, but her voice carried none of its usual confidence. I opened my laptop and turned the screen toward her, displaying a folder containing dozens of photographs from Thursday evening's surveillance. The images showed her arrival at Craig's apartment, her time on his balcony, and her father's participation in the conspiracy. "These were taken Thursday night while you were supposedly helping with electrical emergencies," I said, clicking through the photographic sequence. "The timestamps correspond exactly with your text messages about being at your father's house." Vivian stared at the screen in silence, her face cycling through shock, fear, and desperate calculation. The evidence was irrefutable and comprehensive, eliminating any possibility of alternative explanations or innocent interpretations. "Lawrence, I can explain." "No explanations necessary. I have 14 months of documentation. Location data, phone records, bank statements, photographs, and witness testimony. I know about the Chicago trips that were actually Pocono getaways. I know about your father's financial support and transportation assistance. I know about Craig's apartment key and your regular Tuesday and Thursday appointments." I continued clicking through evidence folders while she watched in stunned silence. Each category of documentation revealed another aspect of the conspiracy, building a comprehensive picture of systematic betrayal and coordinated deception. "The most impressive part," I continued, "is the level of planning involved. This wasn't impulsive adultery or emotional mistake. You and your father invested significant effort in maintaining this fraud while appearing to support our marriage." Vivian finally found her voice, though it trembled with obvious distress. "It's not what you think. Craig and I are just friends. We've been talking through some personal issues. Friends don't spend 4-hour evenings in apartments with wine and romantic conversation. Friends don't take weekend trips to mountain resorts. Friends don't coordinate elaborate deception involving financial support and transportation logistics." I opened another folder containing bank records that showed Donald's regular transfers to her personal account, each coinciding with her fabricated Chicago trips. "Your father has been subsidizing your affair for 6 months. $800 for the last Pocono weekend, $600 for the previous trip, $500 for the one before that. He's not just enabling your adultery, he's financing it." The confrontation continued for 30 minutes, with Vivian alternating between denial, minimization, and desperate attempts at explanation. But the evidence was too comprehensive for successful contradiction, and her responses became increasingly incoherent as she realized the scope of my documentation. "What do you want?" she finally asked, abandoning pretense and acknowledging the reality of exposure. Divorce, immediate separation, full disclosure of assets and financial arrangements, and complete honesty about the extent of this conspiracy. I handed her a manila envelope containing divorce papers that had been prepared by Constance Whitmore and delivered by process server that morning. The documents cited adultery as grounds for dissolution and requested asset division that reflected her misconduct and dissipation of marital resources. "You're also going to call your father and arrange a meeting. He's been an active participant in this deception, and he's going to face the consequences of his choices." Vivian's hands shook as she examined the legal documents, her face reflecting the realization that her carefully constructed double life was completely exposed and legally actionable. "Lawrence, please, we can work through this. Marriage counseling, therapy, whatever you think would help. The time for working through problems was before you started an affair and recruited your father as an accomplice. You made your choices over 14 months of systematic deception. Now you get to live with the consequences." The conversation ended with Vivian agreeing to contact Donald and arrange a meeting for that afternoon. She would inform him that his participation in the conspiracy had been discovered and documented, and that he would need to address his role in the deception. But I had additional plans for Donald Harmon that extended beyond simple confrontation. His betrayal had been particularly egregious because of the trust I'd placed in him and the systematic nature of his deception. Every Sunday dinner handshake had been performance. Every friendly inquiry about my business had been intelligence gathering. Every request for family plan access had been reconnaissance to facilitate his daughter's adultery. He deserved consequences that matched the scope of his betrayal, and I was prepared to provide them through legal channels that would expose his conduct to public scrutiny and professional embarrassment. The afternoon meeting would be the beginning of his reckoning, not the conclusion. Donald Harmon arrived at our house that afternoon with the same confident bearing he'd displayed during countless family dinners, but his composure cracked the moment he saw my prepared documentation spread across the dining room table. "Donald?" I said, gesturing toward a chair across from my organized evidence folders. "Please, sit down. We have a lot to discuss." His handshake, when offered, trembled noticeably, a stark contrast to the firm, confident grip he'd maintained during a year of systematic deception. His eyes moved nervously between the photographs, bank records, and legal documents that covered the table surface. "Vivian mentioned you wanted to talk," he said, his voice carrying none of its usual warmth and authority. "I wanted to show you something interesting," I replied, opening the laptop to display Thursday evening's surveillance photographs. "These were taken while Vivian was supposedly at your house helping with electrical emergencies." The images showed his arrival at Craig's apartment complex, his use of a personal key to enter the building, and his coordination with Vivian's romantic evening. The timestamps and location data eliminated any possibility of innocent explanations. Donald studied the screen in silence, his face reflecting the realization that his active participation in the conspiracy had been comprehensively documented. He'd been caught in systematic deception that extended far beyond simple enablement. "I can explain the circumstances," he began, but I interrupted with additional evidence. "Bank records show 8 months of financial transfers to support Vivian's affair. Phone records document coordination of timing and logistics. Location data proves you've been actively facilitating adultery while maintaining friendly relationships with me." I clicked through folders of documentation while he watched with growing distress. Each category of evidence revealed another aspect of his betrayal, building a comprehensive picture of calculated deception. "The most remarkable aspect," I continued, "is the systematic nature of your participation. This wasn't reluctant assistance or emotional support for your daughter. You invested significant effort in maintaining this fraud while shaking my hand every Sunday and asking about my business plans." Donald's composure finally collapsed completely. His hands shook as he attempted to respond, his voice breaking with obvious emotional distress. "Lawrence, you have to understand." Vivian was unhappy. She felt trapped in the marriage and needed emotional support. Emotional support doesn't require apartment keys and financial subsidies for weekend getaways. Emotional support doesn't involve coordination of deception and systematic lying to the betrayed spouse. I opened another folder containing prepared legal documents that would have significant impact on his personal and professional reputation. Constance Whitmore has prepared a civil lawsuit against you for intentional interference with marital relations and conspiracy to commit adultery. The damages include financial recovery for funds you used to subsidize the affair, plus punitive awards for emotional distress and systematic deception. Donald stared at the legal papers with obvious shock, his face reflecting the realization that his participation in the conspiracy would have consequences extending far beyond family embarrassment. Additionally, I continued, the divorce proceedings will require your testimony under oath about your role in facilitating Vivian's adultery. Perjury charges carry serious criminal penalties if you attempt to minimize or misrepresent your involvement. The conversation continued for 45 minutes, with Donald alternating between desperate explanations and increasingly frantic attempts to negotiate reduced consequences. But the evidence was comprehensive and legally actionable, eliminating any possibility of avoiding responsibility for his choices. "What do you want from me?" he finally asked, echoing his daughter's earlier question. "Complete honesty about the extent of your participation. Full disclosure of financial support you've provided. Testimony in divorce proceedings that accurately represents your role in the conspiracy, and acceptance of legal consequences for your systematic betrayal of trust." I handed him copies of the civil lawsuit documents and divorce testimony requirements, explaining the timeline for legal proceedings and his obligations for truthful cooperation. "You have 48 hours to retain legal counsel and prepare responses to these filings. I recommend complete honesty with your attorney about the scope of your involvement, because the evidence will expose any attempts at minimization or deception." Donald left our house that afternoon as a broken man, his confident bearing replaced by obvious distress and recognition that his choices had created serious legal and personal consequences. But the confrontation was only the beginning of his reckoning. The legal proceedings would expose his conduct to public scrutiny through court filings, testimony, and potential criminal charges if he attempted perjury during divorce proceedings. His reputation in the community, built over decades of professional success and civic involvement, would be permanently damaged by revelations of his role in facilitating adultery and systematic deception. The man who had shaken my hand with false warmth at every family dinner would now face the consequences of his betrayal through legal channels that would ensure appropriate punishment for his choices. That evening, I reviewed the day's confrontations and prepared for the final phase of legal proceedings. Both Vivian and Donald had been exposed and would face appropriate consequences for their systematic betrayal. But I also realized that the confrontations had provided something beyond legal resolution: complete validation of my suspicions and comprehensive proof that my trust had been systematically violated by two people who had pretended to care about my welfare while actively working to deceive me. The handshakes had been performances. The friendly conversations had been intelligence gathering. The expressions of concern had been manipulation designed to maintain access while facilitating betrayal. Now they would face the consequences of their choices through legal proceedings that would ensure appropriate punishment and public exposure of their conduct. The family dinners were over. The handshakes were finished. The deception had ended, and the reckoning had begun. Monday morning brought the formal beginning of legal proceedings that would expose the full scope of the conspiracy and ensure appropriate consequences for systematic betrayal. Constance Whitmore's office had prepared comprehensive filings that addressed both civil and criminal aspects of the case. The divorce petition cited adultery as grounds for dissolution, supported by extensive documentation of Vivian's affair and her father's role in facilitating the deception. The evidence included location data, photographs, phone records, bank statements, and witness testimony that eliminated any possibility of successful contradiction. "This is one of the most thoroughly documented adultery cases I've handled," Constance said during our morning meeting. "The systematic nature of the deception and the father-in-law's active participation create additional legal complications that strengthen your position significantly." She explained the timeline for proceedings, which would begin with temporary orders for separation and asset protection, followed by discovery processes that would require complete financial disclosure from both Vivian and Donald. "The civil lawsuit against Donald Harmon will proceed simultaneously with the divorce," she continued. "Intentional interference with marital relations carries substantial damages, especially when supported by evidence of systematic conspiracy and financial support for adultery. But the most significant development involved potential criminal charges related to perjury and fraud. Donald's financial transfers to support the affair had been structured to avoid detection and minimize tax implications, creating potential violations of financial reporting requirements. If he attempts to minimize his involvement during sworn testimony, we'll have grounds for perjury charges," Constance explained. "The evidence is comprehensive enough to prove systematic deception under oath, which carries serious criminal penalties." The morning also brought responses from Vivian and Donald's newly retained legal counsel. Both had hired experienced family law attorneys who were attempting to negotiate reduced consequences and minimize public exposure of their clients' conduct. "Standard damage control," Constance observed after reviewing their initial communications. "They're hoping to settle quietly and avoid trial proceedings that would expose the full scope of the conspiracy to public scrutiny. But I had no interest in quiet settlements or negotiated resolutions that would allow them to avoid appropriate consequences for their systematic betrayal. The legal proceedings would continue through trial if necessary, ensuring complete exposure of their conduct and maximum legal penalties." The first major development occurred Wednesday morning, when Donald's attorney contacted Constance to discuss potential plea arrangements related to the civil lawsuit. The communication indicated that Donald was prepared to acknowledge his role in facilitating the affair in exchange for reduced financial penalties. "He's terrified of public exposure," Constance explained during our phone conversation. "His attorney is emphasizing the potential damage to his professional reputation and community standing if the case proceeds to trial." The fear was justified. Donald's consulting business depended on professional relationships and community trust that would be permanently damaged by revelations of his role in systematic adultery conspiracy. His clients would question his integrity and reliability if court proceedings exposed his willingness to engage in elaborate deception. But his terror of exposure also created strategic opportunities for ensuring complete accountability. "I could accept his acknowledgement of guilt while maintaining the right to pursue maximum legal consequences if his testimony proved incomplete or deceptive." Thursday brought more significant developments when Vivian's attorney requested emergency hearings to address temporary support and asset protection issues. The motion indicated that she was experiencing financial difficulties without access to joint accounts and Donald's supplemental support. "She's discovering the cost of systematic deception," Constance observed. "The affair was financially sustainable when she had access to marital resources and her father's subsidies. Now she's facing the reality of supporting herself without those advantages." The emergency hearing provided an opportunity to present evidence publicly for the first time. Court proceedings would create official records of the conspiracy and establish legal precedents for the remaining litigation. Judge Raymond Cross presided over the hearing with obvious interest in the extensive documentation I'd prepared. He reviewed location data, photographs, bank records, and communication logs while questioning both parties about the circumstances surrounding the marital breakdown. "Mr. Harmon," he said, addressing Donald directly, "the evidence suggests you provided substantial financial support for your daughter's extramarital relationship. Can you explain your reasoning for these actions? Donald's response was hesitant and obviously uncomfortable. He acknowledged providing financial assistance, but attempted to characterize it as general family support rather than specific subsidies for adultery. The bank records show transfers that coincide exactly with Mrs. Blackwood's travel expenses for romantic getaways with Mr. Ellison, Judge Cross continued. Are you claiming these correlations are coincidental? The questioning continued for 20 minutes, with Donald's explanations becoming increasingly unconvincing as the evidence contradicted his attempts at minimization. His testimony was creating an official record of systematic deception that would support both civil and criminal proceedings. Mrs. Blackwood, Judge Cross said, turning his attention to Vivian. The location data shows regular visits to Mr. Ellison's residence while you were reporting different locations to your husband. How do you explain these discrepancies? Vivian's response was similarly unconvincing, alternating between claims of innocent friendship and attempts to blame marital problems for her decision to seek outside companionship. But the evidence was too comprehensive for successful contradiction. Judge Cross issued temporary orders that reflected the strength of my documentation and the systematic nature of the betrayal. Vivian would receive minimal spousal support. Donald would be required to provide complete financial disclosure for the civil lawsuit, and both would be prohibited from disposing of assets pending final resolution. The evidence presented today suggests systematic deception and conspiracy to commit adultery, he stated, for the official record. These proceedings will continue with full investigation of all parties' conduct and appropriate legal consequences. The hearing concluded with clear judicial recognition that the conspiracy was legally actionable and deserving of serious consequences. The official record would support maximum penalties in subsequent proceedings. That evening, I reviewed the day's developments and prepared for the next phase of legal action. The temporary hearing had established judicial recognition of systematic betrayal and created official records that would support comprehensive consequences. But more importantly, it had provided the first public exposure of Donald and Vivian's conduct, beginning the process of community awareness that would ensure social consequences beyond legal penalties. The handshakes and friendly conversations were now matters of official court record, documented as systematic deception in legal proceedings that would be accessible to anyone interested in understanding the scope of their betrayal. The reckoning was proceeding exactly as planned, with legal consequences that matched the systematic nature of their conspiracy against me. The weeks following the temporary hearing brought cascading consequences that extended far beyond legal proceedings. Donald's consulting business began losing clients as word of the court testimony spread through professional networks, while Vivian discovered that community sympathy for betrayed spouses significantly outweighed support for unfaithful wives. Constance Whitmore's office provided regular updates on the expanding legal complications. The civil lawsuit against Donald had attracted attention from the state attorney general's office, which was investigating potential tax fraud related to his financial support for the affair. Structured payments to avoid reporting requirements create federal implications, she explained during our weekly meeting. If the IRS determines he was deliberately concealing financial transfers, the penalties could include criminal charges beyond our civil lawsuit. The investigation had revealed that Donald's support for Vivian's affair totaled over $12,000 during the previous year, with individual transfers carefully structured to avoid triggering automatic reporting requirements. The pattern suggested deliberate tax evasion rather than innocent family assistance. Meanwhile, Vivian's financial situation continued deteriorating as she faced the reality of supporting herself without access to marital assets or her father's subsidies. Her attorney had filed multiple motions requesting increased temporary support, but Judge Cross had consistently denied the requests based on her misconduct and waste of marital resources. She's learning that adultery has economic consequences, Constance observed. The court isn't sympathetic to financial hardship that results from systematic deception and betrayal of marital obligations. But the most significant development involved Craig Ellison's response to being identified as the third party in divorce proceedings. His employer had initiated an internal investigation after receiving court documents that detailed his role in the affair, particularly his provision of apartment access and coordination with the conspiracy. Healthcare companies maintained strict ethical standards for executive employees, and Craig's involvement in systematic adultery conspiracy raised questions about his judgment and reliability. The investigation could result in termination or professional sanctions that would permanently damage his career prospects. Third parties often face unexpected consequences when adultery becomes public, Constance explained. Employers, professional organizations, and community members make judgments about character and trustworthiness based on revealed conduct. The expanding consequences created additional pressure on all parties to resolve the litigation quickly and quietly. But I remained committed to full legal proceedings that would ensure complete accountability and public exposure of their systematic betrayal. Friday morning brought the most dramatic development yet. Donald's arrest on federal tax evasion charges related to his financial support for the affair. The IRS investigation had uncovered additional financial irregularities in his consulting business, including unreported income and fraudulent deductions that extended beyond his support for Vivian's adultery. The adultery investigation opened a larger examination of his financial practices, Constance explained after receiving notification from federal prosecutors. Systematic deception in personal matters often correlates with professional misconduct. Donald's arrest created immediate complications for both the civil lawsuit and divorce proceedings. His criminal defense attorney advised against providing testimony that might incriminate him in federal charges, while prosecutors expressed interest in his cooperation regarding other potential financial crimes. The situation had evolved from family law disputes to federal criminal investigation, with consequences that would extend far beyond the original adultery conspiracy. Donald's professional reputation was permanently destroyed, his business was under federal investigation, and his personal finances were subject to criminal penalties. But his arrest also created strategic opportunities for resolving the remaining litigation on favorable terms. His desperation to minimize additional criminal exposure made him willing to accept substantial civil penalties in exchange for avoiding further investigation of his financial practices. He's prepared to settle the civil lawsuit for maximum damages, his attorney informed Constance during plea negotiations. Complete acknowledgement of wrongdoing, full financial restitution, and public apology in exchange for our cooperation in limiting the scope of federal investigation. The proposed settlement would provide financial recovery that exceeded my original expectations while ensuring public acknowledgement of his systematic betrayal. The terms included substantial monetary penalties, complete admission of guilt, and written apology that could be made public. Meanwhile, Vivian's situation continued deteriorating as she faced the combined pressures of divorce proceedings, financial hardship, and social isolation. Her affair with Craig had ended abruptly when his employer's investigation began, leaving her without romantic companionship or financial support. Her attorney had begun discussing settlement negotiations that would minimize her exposure to additional legal consequences while acknowledging her misconduct and accepting reduced asset distribution. The proposed terms reflected her weakened position and the strength of evidence against her. She's realized that fighting the divorce will only create additional exposure and expense, Constance explained. The evidence is too comprehensive for successful contradiction, and continued litigation would only increase her legal costs while ensuring additional public scrutiny. The settlement discussions represented complete vindication of my decision to document the conspiracy systematically before initiating legal action. The comprehensive evidence had eliminated their ability to contest the proceedings or negotiate from positions of strength. Both Donald and Vivian were facing consequences that matched the systematic nature of their betrayal: legal penalties, financial losses, professional damage, and social disgrace that would have permanent impact on their lives and reputations. The handshakes and friendly conversations had been exposed as calculated deception in federal court proceedings that would remain part of public record permanently. Their conspiracy had been documented, prosecuted, and punished through legal channels that ensured appropriate accountability. But the most satisfying aspect of the developing resolution was the complete reversal of power dynamics. For over a year, they had controlled the deception, while I remained unaware of their conspiracy. Now I controlled the legal proceedings, while they faced consequences they couldn't avoid or minimize. The final phase of litigation would formalize their accountability and ensure that the consequences matched the scope of their systematic betrayal of trust and marriage vows. 6 months after the confrontation that exposed their conspiracy, the legal proceedings concluded with complete vindication of my decision to document their systematic betrayal before taking action. The final settlements provided financial recovery, public accountability, and permanent consequences that matched the scope of their deception. Donald Harmon pleaded guilty to federal tax evasion charges and received 18 months in minimum security prison, along with substantial financial penalties and permanent damage to his professional reputation. His consulting business collapsed completely, with clients terminating contracts and professional associations revoking his certifications. The civil lawsuit concluded with a settlement that required him to pay $200,000 in damages, provide written acknowledgement of his role in facilitating adultery, and submit to public apology that was published in the local newspaper. The terms ensured that his systematic betrayal would be permanently documented in legal and public records. Vivian's divorce settlement reflected her misconduct and waste of marital resources. She received minimal asset distribution, no spousal support, and was required to acknowledge her adultery in official court filings that became part of public record. Her financial situation remained precarious, with limited employment prospects and no family support system. Craig Ellison was terminated from his position after his employer's investigation concluded that his involvement in systematic adultery conspiracy demonstrated poor judgment incompatible with executive responsibility. His professional reputation was permanently damaged, making career advancement in healthcare management unlikely. The comprehensive legal resolution provided complete accountability for their systematic deception while ensuring that the consequences would have permanent impact on their lives and reputations. The conspiracy that had required extensive coordination and careful planning had been exposed, prosecuted, and punished through legal channels that eliminated any possibility of avoiding responsibility. But beyond the legal vindication, the proceedings had provided something more valuable: complete validation that my suspicions were justified and my decision to investigate systematically before confronting anyone was strategically sound. The evidence had been comprehensive enough to eliminate all alternative explanations and ensure maximum legal consequences. The handshakes that had felt like performances were documented as calculated deception in federal court proceedings. The friendly conversations that had seemed like intelligence gathering were proven to be exactly that through phone records and testimony. The expressions of concern that had felt like manipulation were exposed as systematic betrayal of trust. Donald Harmon would never shake my hand again, because he would be serving federal prison time for the financial crimes that his adultery conspiracy had exposed. Vivian would never manufacture another emergency, because she no longer had access to the resources or relationships that had made her deception possible. The circuit was closed, the conspiracy was exposed, the consequences were permanent. And I had learned that sometimes the most satisfying revenge is simply allowing people to face the natural results of their own choices, documented thoroughly and prosecuted completely through legal channels that ensure appropriate accountability. The family dinners were over. The handshakes had ended. The lies had been exposed. Justice had been served. one documented deception at a time.